Chapter 4. Quote, A Nation Restored, end quote. 2. Foreign Policy and Trade, 1783 to 93. The American War was widely considered to be a national disaster. In 1781, devastating defeats on land and sea made the outcome inevitable, and as one historian has put it, quote, the entire British military system appeared in ruins, end quote. Not only did the Treaty of Versailles 2 years later unequivocally confirm the independence of the 13 mainland colonies, Britain was forced to accept the loss of some West Indies islands to France and the return of Florida and Minorca to Spain. Still worse, in a century during which the balance of power in Europe frequently turned on the creation of effective alliance systems, Britain in 1783 was Britain starkly isolated. This isolation was underlined by the establishment of a close French alliance with the Dutch in 1785. This overthrew the pro-British House of Orange and threatened British commerce. Insofar as Britain possessed a consistent European strategy in the early years of the Pitt government, it was to support the Dutch and resist any French attempts to increase their influence in the Low Countries. Since the Prussians, allies during the 7 Years' War of 1756-63, felt a similar unease, a concerted effort to revive the fortunes of the House of Orange was not difficult to manage. A successful Prussian military incursion into Holland in 1787 was followed the next year by a triple alliance between Prussia, the United Provinces, Holland, and Britain. Its main aim was to deter aggression from France or Austria and, more generally, to preserve European peace. Britain's signature to the treaty also helped to restore its diplomatic standing to a level not enjoyed since the early 1760s. The death of Frederick the Great and the succession of the far less able Frederick William II helped Britain to sway Prussia and employ the alliance as a sword of Damocles over the Bourbon family compact, which held France and Spain in by now flaccid alliance. The solidity of the Triple Alliance also encouraged Britain to take a hard line against Spain. In May 1789, a Spanish warship laid anchor at Nootka Sound on Vancouver Island in the North Pacific. It seized ships from a British trading base for fish and furs at the Sound. Britain demanded reparations for losses incurred. In a letter to Pitt, the Foreign Secretary, the Duke of Leeds evoked the code of the duel, quote, I cannot possibly approve of any measure, against Spain, short of a direct unqualified satisfaction for the insult. War, of course, must result, end quote. Spain did indeed threaten war on Britain. However, it was soon clear, firstly, that Britain was amply prepared, and secondly, that once revolution had broken out in France, its monarch, the inept Louis XVI, was unable to do much in support of this Bourbon family ally in Spain. Louis's attempts to equip the French navy in support of Spain were nullified by the French National Assembly. The resolution of the crisis saw British ships return, trading rights confirmed, and Spain humiliated. It took Spain almost 4 years to stump up the reparations demanded, but the favorable settlement itself was ample compensation for the long wait. British fishing rights were confirmed, and traders were free to settle along the coast between Alaska and California. The outcome of Nootka Sound was seen as the high water mark of Britain's recovery after the apparent disaster of the loss of America. William Eden, one of Pitt's ablest diplomats, told him that, quote, there never was a business better conducted or better concluded, and there never was a moment in which our country held such preeminency among nations, end quote. Others, perhaps including Pitt himself, harbored delusions of a British hegemony in Europe. An obscure fortification on the northern shore of the Black Sea quickly supplied a reality check. Ochakov had been captured from the Turks in December 1788 during a brief war between the two nations. On both strategic and commercial grounds, the Duke of Leeds, Britain's foreign secretary, feared Russian expansion through the Black Sea into southern Europe and the Mediterranean. Accordingly, the Duke of Leeds used the Triple Alliance to demand that Russia return the port to the Turks. Pitt initially supported his foreign secretary, but found in Catherine the Great an altogether wilier and tougher antagonist than he had yet encountered. He called British bluff. By the time she made her own unforced peace with Turkey, British threats had long been humiliatingly withdrawn. Most unusually, Pitt left his domestic front unguarded. Fox was able to capitalize on the Russophile sentiments of the Whigs. For a couple of weeks in April, during which the Duke of Leeds resigned in protest at Pitt's climb down, Fox believed himself in realistic contention for office. A friend informed Auckland in May 1791 that, quote, "the country throughout have told Mr. Pitt they will not go to war," end quote. A party leader with cleaner hands than Fox would have had, quote, "little difficulty in getting into office," end quote. The Ochakov incident in itself is trivial, yet in broader context it contributed towards increasing Britain's hostility toward Russia. Fear of Russian expansionism would dog and pervert British foreign policy for much of the 19th century. It also curbed the ambitions and influence of British ambassadors who exaggerated it on limited knowledge into a major disaster. The crisis also put the Triple Alliance into perspective. Within months, the greed of Prussia, Austria, and Russia in pursuing the further dismemberment of Poland begun in 1772, destroyed the alliance altogether. Britain remained as isolated, though diplomatically of more weight, in 1793 as in 1783. Section 2. Britain's partial rehabilitation in Europe is one strand in the continental policy of this period. Trade is the other. Pitt's commercial policies were not novel except in the scale on which he worked. Envoys were dispatched to all the leading courts of Europe to negotiate reciprocally lowered tariff duties. The Foreign Secretary, the Marquis of Carmarthen, from 1789, Duke of Leeds, spoke dismissively and uncomprehendingly about the, quote, "present rage for commercial treaties," end quote. He feared that scrabbling in the marketplace would reduce the nation's gravitas on the world stage. The fact that most of the embassies came to nothing despite 8 years and more of negotiation with Spain, Portugal, and Russia is evidence enough that British protected markets would not be relinquished without adequate counter-attractions. The 1780s saw no headlong rush along the new highway of free trade. The Eden Trade Treaty with France, signed in September 1786, is the only solid achievement of the policy, and that a temporary one. For just over 6 years, till war destroyed the fragile experiment, French wines entered Britain at the same preferential rates as the Portuguese. Manufacturers' opposition kept the market for silks heavily protected. France was open to British manufactured goods in a general tariff reduction of 10 to 15%. It was a small enough concession, but one which the northern manufacturers were well placed to exploit. Within 3 years, French manufacturers were objecting that the treaty had been unfairly weighted in favor of their traditional enemies. It seemed so because of the keen competition from British ironmasters and mill owners in the early stages of industrialization. Though the virtual collapse of the French economy in the mid-1780s was a hindrance to British exporters, the Eden Treaty gives the first hint of that concealed monopoly which Britain was to enjoy as it became the world's first industrial nation. The liberalization of trade was bound to favor the most efficient producers. Britain's later commitment to free trade by no means represented an intellectual conversion to a persuasive doctrine. British manufacturers were backing a horse which could not lose. Significantly, it was those manufacturers using new techniques who supported the treaty. Even as early as 1786, fear of the smaller and more specialist producers in the South that freer trade would harm them split the General Chamber of Manufacturers and destroyed its effectiveness as a pressure group. The General Chamber had come into being in March 1785 to protest against Pitt's determination to establish a customs union between Britain and Ireland. With duties to be set at the lower Irish rate, Pitt explained to the Duke of Rutland, Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, quote, "We open to Ireland the chance of competition with ourselves on terms of more than equality, and we give her advantages which make it impossible she should ever have anything to fear from the jealousy and restrictive policy of this country in the future." End quote. Pitt's plan was part of a grand design to secure, quote, "permanent tranquility," end quote, in Ireland on the basis of mutual commercial interest. What English manufacturers saw as a threat, particularly to the wool trade from what English manufacturers saw was a threat, particularly to the wool trade, from low-wage Irish competition. The establishment of an industrial pressure group was the result. It is not without irony that its first chairman was the master potter Josiah Wedgwood, a passionate exponent of freer trade with Europe, where the balance of advantage was more obviously tilted in Britain's favor. Though the coup de grace was delivered in Dublin by the Irish Parliament's refusal to contribute to the cost of imperial defence, industrial opposition would have made the plan extremely difficult to operate. Irish problems after this setback were to bedevil Pitt periodically during the rest of his career. Though the Eden Treaty stimulated trade, more important factors were the return of peace in 1783 and the early flowering of Britain's industrial potential. Northern and Midland industrialists could undercut the world in both the range and price of manufactured goods. The value of British trade to Europe almost doubled between 1783 and 1792, during which time a trading deficit of £2.5 million was converted into a surplus of almost £2 million. The value of the diplomatic scurrying between the courts of Europe in enthusiastic pursuit of commercial accord may be doubted. The motivating principle in any case was not economic ideology, but pure self-interest. The commitment to, quote, empire remained central to British government policy for most of the 18th century. Here, as in much else, Pitt continued the policies of his predecessors. For much of the century, press discussion about the value and virtue of empire had concentrated upon colonies as essential for commercial prosperity, and commercial prosperity as the foundation of national power and self-esteem. Hence the extraordinary care lavished by successive governments on the Navy. Naval supremacy was rightly perceived as the linchpin of that profitable imperial commercial nexus which had grown with such extraordinary vigor since the Treaty of Utrecht ended the wars with France in 1713. Hence also the importance attached to administrative efficiency at the Navy Board throughout the century, and the commitment to naval expansion during the decade after the loss of the American colonies. Despite considerable taxation and debt burdens produced by the American War, Pitt's government committed itself to restocking the Navy during the 1780s. Commercial tonnage had expanded rapidly. Between 1760 and 1792, British-owned shipping tonnage increased from 600,000 to 1.5 million, and by 1787, Lord Hawkesbury, Pitt's president of the Board of Trade, could draw the obvious strategic conclusion. Quote, "The navigation of this country is so well protected at present by the laws that are made to favor it, as well as by the excellence of our ships and sailors, that nothing in my judgment is to be apprehended from the rivalship of the French in this respect." End quote. Pitt therefore placed more reliance on the solid base of the mercantile marine than on ephemeral trade treaties. Ultimately, his trust lay in solid oak, not diplomatic parchment. Let me see. In the trade expansion of the 18th century, Section 3. In the trade expansion of the 18th century, the Americas had assumed a pivotal role. The old colonial system, based on heavily protected markets and rigidly regulated trade between colonies and mother country for the benefit of the latter, was threatened by the liberation of the eastern seaboard states. The assumption was that the newly independent colonies must be cut out of the imperial economic system. After 1783, the United States were seen as a threat to British naval and mercantile supremacy in the New World. Thus, when West Indian sugar planters, threatened by moves to bar U.S. shipping from their ports, petitioned the government in 1784 to allow trade to continue in, quote, all such lumber, provision, and other produce as might legally have been so imported or exported before the late war, end quote, they were rebuffed. Orders in council prohibited direct trade between the sugar islands and the mainland, and Pitt's new Committee of Trade, under the influence of Charles Jenkinson, George III's political advisor, rejected the ideas of Shelburne and the new school of economists who wished to reduce trade barriers. Trade with the USA was not to be reciprocal. Any threat to British naval and mercantile supremacy in the New World would be strenuously resisted. West Indian merchants were to be cut off from their main timber supplies and could trade their molasses only in British ships. The sugar interest, whose importance was in decline after a century at the very heart of Britain's commercial concerns, learned that its well-being came second to that of shipping. The West Indies remained a secure market for British manufactured goods and metals and high-priced luxuries for the planters, cheap textiles for their slaves. Annoyance at inflexibility in London could to a degree be braved. The shipping interest, however, required nurture from American independence. About one-third of the British merchant fleet in the early 1770s had been built in the 13 colonies. Britain had therefore lost not only a substantial source of revenue, the United States retained an important shipping interest of its own. The interests of the planters were not entirely ignored, of course. Their desperate need for provisions could not be met by the Canadians, as the government had fondly hoped, and from 1787 a, quote, free port, end quote, system was introduced to permit small American vessels to trade in carefully regulated necessities, mostly raw materials. The concession benefited Britain in that it stimulated recovery in the West Indies, thus enabling planters to take more from Britain. After virtual stagnation in the 1780s, exports to the West Indies trebled in the 1790s. The passage of the last great Navigation Act in 1786 provided further evidence of Jenkins' orthodox protectionist policy towards trade in the Americas. The act's purpose was to encourage domestic shipbuilders by confining colonial trade to British ships and defining, quote, British, end quote, strictly. Its prime aim was to disadvantage United States carriers, particularly in those northern states which, like Massachusetts, had precipitated the War of Independence. Jenkinson's calculations were commercial rather than vindictive. If the USA could be prevented from developing a mercantile marine of threatening proportions, so the argument ran, the effect of colonial deprivation might be turned to positive account. As Jenkinson told the Commons, quote, if proper means could be devised to secure the navigation trade to Great Britain, though we had lost a dominion, we might almost be said to have gained an empire, end quote. The Navigation Act was one of the many issues which preserved glacial diplomatic relations between Britain and the USA after 1783. Commercial advantages on both sides of the Atlantic, however, pulled in other directions. Before independence, the seaboard states had been the largest market for British manufactured goods. The Treaty of Versailles, as the Americans quickly discovered, did not alter economic facts. Indeed, the speed of Britain's development in its early industrial phases only confirmed the pattern. No country would match British variety, quality, and cost. By 1785, British exports to the USA were back to the levels achieved in the early 1770s. American protection in the late 1780s and early 1790s acted only as a minor irritant, though tariffs were used to exercise political leverage on Britain as well as to rectify an alarming trade deficit. After 1793, with Britain involved in a European war with substantial colonial implications in the West, with Jenkinson, now ennobled as Lord Hawkesbury, overshadowed by the influence of Grenville and Dundas, D-U-N-D-A-S, the Americans discovered more sympathetic ears in Whitehall. The Jay Treaty of November 1794 opened certain markets to American shipping and ended mercantile discrimination for a period of 10 years. Before long, the prized West Indian markets were further opened to the Americans. The effects were dramatic. Britain's exports to the USA more than doubled between 1793 and 1799. Crucial also was the development of the cotton trade, which at last provided the United States with a secure market for its raw materials. By 1800, the USA was taking more than a quarter of British exports. The Americas together accounted for about half. Economic logic, as much as the exigencies of war, dictated a more liberal policy toward the USA. Canada, still British, offered fewer glittering prizes. Still, its furs, fish, and above all its timber were not to be despised. Though its scattered population of 300,000 offered a smaller market for the British manufacturer, that population did contain a significant number of émigré loyalists. Canada assumed greater strategic importance after 1783 as a barrier both to possible northward American expansion and as a counterweight to continuing Anglophobia in the United States. Grenville's separation of Upper and Lower Canada in 1791 reflected growing British concern for the colony and also an imprecise but genuine desire to mingle colonial direction with a measure of local self-determination. More precise was the desire to stifle any possible independence movements north of the Great Lakes. Section 4. It was natural that the loss of the American colonies should focus government attention on the East, where markets were less well developed but possessed even greater potential. Britain imported large quantities of cotton, spices, and tea from India, the East Indies, where Dutch influence prevailed, and from China. The China tea trade was crucial as that beverage earned its status as Britain's national drink towards the end of the century. Average annual consumption was about 1.5 pounds a head in 1800, a five-fold increase over the century. About 7 million pounds of China tea was imported to London in 1750. This had almost quadrupled to 25 million pounds of China tea by 1815. As imports by volume from the East were less than 2/3 of those from the West and exports under 1/3, it was an area in which progress could be made. The fulcrum of the East was India, where all British activity was controlled either by East India Company officials in the subcontinent or from the company's London offices in Leadenhall Street. Its trade monopoly extended throughout the East, though, quote, private, end quote, traders were permitted under strict license. As interested merchants were not slow to note, a trading monopoly no less than the company's continued military activity was an evident anachronism after the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763. American trade was in the hands of private merchants, and the Royal African Company and the Levant Company monopolies had ceased in the 1750s. East India Company activities, though vast, were ramshackled, and its independence of action a source of growing worry to successive governments. Naturally, company patronage was enormous, and its unfettered distribution the source of scandalized gossip even among hardened borough mongers. Worst of all, its finances were precarious. Yet such was their importance that any erosion of confidence could have dire effects on investment in the London money markets. It was therefore vital to get a grip on India. Pitt's India Act, though a compromise wrung from company directors scared out of their wits by Fox's yet more radical proposals, offered a basis for business-like relations. Though the company kept its patronage, effective political and strategic control passed from it. In 1793, Indian affairs became the responsibility of Henry Dundas, as president of the Board of Control. Dundas, apprenticed in the devious arts of Scottish patronage manipulation, was the ideal man to prune the more luxuriant growth of the East. In India itself, the Governor-General from 1786 to 1793 was Earl Cornwallis. Having negotiated himself larger powers than those originally laid down by the Act of 1784, he effected substantial reforms. Sinecures were suppressed and able recruits enlisted. Effective British administration based on colonial control with indigenous assistance dates from the Cornwallis era. The Governor-General was unable, however, to secure government control of the company's troops. Nor did Dundas have things all his own way. His plans to reduce the company's £14 million debt ran into trouble, and ambitious schemes to liberalize trade between the Indies and Spain came to nothing. Company opposition, secured by the experience of monopoly over 2 centuries, was not to be overridden in a decade. The true achievement of Pitt's government was to school the company to think for the first time in terms of dual authority, thus enabling a relatively painless eventual transfer of power. Improved relations with local Indian princes, itself a reflection of greater government involvement, also reduced dangers of foreign intervention. When the company's charter was renewed in 1792, Dundas did not feel it necessary to present his initial intention to reorganize the military command. The company retained control over transportation to Britain while ceding some independent trading rights in the East. From its protected revenues, the company was to pay the exchequer an annual sum of £500,000. Trade in the East in these years was generally buoyant, but exotic schemes to extend the geographical limits met with mixed success. Preeminent among these was a plan to reduce the enormous deficit of the China tea trade by inducing the emperor to break with tradition and import Western manufactured goods. Lord Macartney's famous embassy to Peking in 1792 was elaborately staged by Pitt and Dundas. East India Company directors jibbed at footing the bill and received great publicity. The emperor remained impervious to the blandishments of Western civilization, although some limited progress was made. Indian raw cotton, Asian spices, and sub rosa opium entered the Chinese market to the further benefit of a company trading account already swollen by a much larger share of the European tea market following Pitt's Commutation Act. Negotiations with the Dutch over the South Pacific had both strategic and commercial aims. Pitt was prepared to guarantee the Dutch monopoly of the spice trade in return for naval bases in Ceylon and the Malayan archipelago, which could be used to block any French expansionist initiatives. Complex missions by Harris and Auckland petered out in the confused European situation after 1789, despite a further, but perhaps not entirely serious, offer to the Dutch of a share of the Indian market. Britain's domestic imports almost tripled in the 20 years after 1784. Imports stimulated by the massive increase in demand for textile raw materials, particularly cotton, more than doubled. The Industrial Revolution is much more responsible for this than any grand design of the Pitt administration. Government initiatives were more consolidatory than innovatory. Neo-mercantilism, encompassing genuinely reciprocal reductions in tariff, was the order of the day. In conclusion, therefore, the loss of the American colonies proved anything but disastrous for the British economy. The mother country did not withdraw from direct colonial involvement in favor of a, quote, informal commercial empire, end quote. There was, however, a determination to avoid heavy-handed and centralized controls in the remaining colonies, as in those outposts, like Cape Colony, Trinidad, or Ceylon, which were added to the British Empire as the spoils of war after 1793. Nor is there convincing evidence of a, quote, swing to the east, end quote, as used to be thought in conscious reaction to failures in America. British trade involved a worldwide search for markets with the emphasis on raw materials for import and manufactured goods for export. Lack of government resources in any case prevented the emergence of a global commercial grand design. The process of, quote, economical reform, end quote, in 1782 had suppressed both the presidency of the Board of Trade and the secretaryship of the colonies. Though the presidency returned to the cabinet with Hawkesbury in 1791, a separate secretaryship for the colonies did not appear until Palmerston's government in 1855. From 1801, the post was usually a minor part of the Secretary for War's duties. Commercial matters other than those concerning India, where Dundas was characteristically to the fore, usually developed devolved on undersecretaries in the in the Home Department. Like like the precocious Cornishman Evan Nepean, Nepean, maybe it's Nepean, acquired influence by thorough mastery of their brief. The work of such men appointed to the future development of the civil service and was a fruit of Pitt's administrative reforms. Nepean's abilities were to win for him influence and perquisites in the West Indies, a knighthood and a baronetcy. His final post in an immensely crowded career was as governor of Bombay from 1812 to 1819. Pitt himself rarely needed to give colonial matters priority, but he sustained conventional imperial objectives. He aimed to secure continued supplies of cheap raw materials and an accommodation of mutual interests with the United States. In Europe, he moved cautiously toward reciprocal reductions of tariffs. Such inducements sufficed for manufacturers to recoup with interest the losses of the American War. Pitt's policy also helped to give Britain a degree of financial security, which was to be vital in her strategy for its next and much greater wars against the French. End of chapter 4.